And so we're going to go ahead and kick it off. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Greg Claxton with the Planning Department. I've got an update on the Housing and Infrastructure Study, and this is getting into some of our thinking around some of the recommendations that we anticipate bringing to you in June. So in some cases, I'll have specific numbers. The focus isn't those, like those may be still subject to change as we're sort of testing things out. But really what we're trying to get across is how we're thinking about kind of balancing different interests through the process. So I've got a brief update on the workshops we've been doing the last couple of weeks, talking with the public, potential changes to current standards, and then our thinking on two new potential zoning districts. So the workshops, I think, have been a good opportunity for members of the public to kind of come out and talk to us in a fair amount of detail. We've got a lot of information. We've got a couple of hands-on activities for people to help get a sense of scale, especially for these new housing types. And then thinking about and talking about the project generally. A lot of good discussion, a lot of folks who have strong feelings on either side, but also a lot of people who feel kind of a little bit in the middle. They're worried about housing prices. They're worried about people's ability to afford to buy a home, but they're also concerned about the character of the areas around them. Some of the remaining questions and concerns we've heard is, we're talking a lot about the kinds of housing and what it would take to allow that. And obviously one of the big questions is where we're thinking for those. And we talked through the growth and preservation concept map for that. We also talked through kind of that we're coming back out for further community engagement later this year around that specific question. There's an interest in figuring out kind of how to advocate. Okay, no problem. There's an interest in sort of figuring out how to use this process to advocate for more housing, but also distrust over kind of how and whether the feedback will be considered. I think the conversations we've been having so far, it feels like a typical engagement process. Some of the comments that we've gotten, big fan of more homes for more neighbors on the one hand, but rezoning our suburbs would be ruinous. Madison is saturated, too much traffic already, as kind of the ends of the spectrum. And again, none of that is surprising, but it's a good opportunity for us to sort of talk through, hear where people are, and help them see kind of what we're doing so they've got a greater understanding. So I'm going to start with walking through the categories of changes that we're thinking about. Most of these are present in some form at the workshops, but I'm going to start with a cluster of things that we're thinking about, changes to the current R and RS standards. That's 1 and 2 family and 1 family zoning districts. And so this is, the starting point would be thinking about changing the bulk standards to kind of bring the scale of new housing a little bit closer to this, the scale of what's around it. And so here we're thinking reducing the heights of new construction to 2.5 stories within some number of feet. I've left that a little blank right now because there's a few things that we're working with at the same time, and we want to make sure we get into a number there that's appropriate. So some of the things that we're looking at is sort of cleaning up how heights are measured, kind of where you're measuring from, getting that more consistent by building type and location in the county, whether to include or exclude raised foundations or an exposed basement. On the right, you can see the current code within the urban zoning overlay that kind of the building height is 3 stories within 45 feet, but there's an additional provision that you can include, that can be measured from the top of an exposed basement. That could add up to 7 feet, getting you potentially to a 52-foot tall building. That's a very tall building, even for 3 stories, and so that's the kind of thing we want to bring it down a little bit. So in addition to the exposed foundation, we're also thinking about including measurements to the eave and to the roof line as part of a requirement or an encouragement to include pitched roofs. Again, with the idea that kind of creates a little bit more, form that's a little bit more in character with most neighborhoods. As part of this, we've learned that the definition for a half story that's in the code which is just attached to the contextual overlay. It's not a general definition. Codes has a very tough time implementing that. And so we're looking to see, is there kind of a simpler way to measure that that's kind of a little bit more in line with kind of what their inspectors would need to do when they go out and measure. So, and then last, we are thinking about, like, is it appropriate to retain kind of the existing heights in some conditions? And so that could be in zoning districts that have deeper setbacks or larger lot sizes, you know, sort of having the height a little further away tends to reduce the visual scale of it. Or alternately, you know, kind of allowing it on larger roads, that major and collector street plan, for example. That's not something we've landed on, but that's part of how we're trying to think through kind of the interest of kind of keeping things in scale, the urban form that we're creating, but also, you know, that there is a market for large homes in parts of the county. So to give a sense of what this means in practice, we've started taking a look at the height and size of buildings that have been constructed since 2010. And so on the left is the median finish area. That's kind of the finished area of a home by the height. And so you can see for 2.5 stories, it's actually larger on average than 3-story homes, which is a little quirky. Part of that could be that there's just a smaller number of homes that are built to 2.5 stories versus 3, so we want to be a little cautious there. But it doesn't seem like 2.5-story requirement on its own would really bring the height or bring the scale of buildings down. It's just getting the form to fit a little bit better. We had a question from the commission last time about, well, is that just making buildings more squat? And so on the right side is sort of the typical first floor area. And you see 2.5-story buildings there are a little bit larger than 3 stories. So maybe that's it, or maybe it's just that they're bigger in general. Broadly though, I think this confirms to us that this is about sort of the form and matching the context rather than controlling the size of homes. The next thing I want to talk through is that we're taking a look at allowing detached accessory dwelling units within R and RS districts within the USD. And so some of the things that we're contemplating here is potentially having a size difference for how large the dadu can be based on the size of the lot, again with the idea of fitting into the context a little bit better. One suggestion we've heard in conversation with the community, one thing that other communities have done with an interest in encouraging entry-level home ownership is that the potential to allow the dadu to be separately owned. That's something we think we would take that decision very seriously. That's not something we look at lightly. And we would want to think very carefully, not just about the ownership and how that changes the dynamic of it, but also what that means for short-term rentals. Anecdotally, our sense is that dadus seem to go in and out of the rental pool over time. They may be built by one owner, rented out, but then when ownership changes, the new owners may have no interest in renting it out. So they just use it as a guest room, a home office, when people visit, that kind of thing. We do think that it would add flexibility that help homeowners adjust to changing circumstances. Again, you know, changes in family members who may need to move in, the typical granny flat, that kind of thing. Overall, our expectation is that this would not produce a substantial number of new homes. Again, it's more about meeting that flexibility. And then the last thing in this category of changes within R and RS is just within the 1 and 2 family districts, the R districts. So here we're looking at simplifying the rules for duplexes within our districts. There's a very long set of conditions that get to when the property was subdivided, when it was first entitled, how it was subdivided. We're looking at allowing 2 units within our parcels that meet the minimum lot size. If a parcel is specifically platted as duplex or single family, it wouldn't change that. To give a sense of scale, we went through and sort of did a few passes to see how many parcels met different conditions. And so there are about 87,000 parcels in Davidson County that are zoned within our district. Excluding things like condos, open space, cemeteries, parks, that kind of thing, we get down to about 60,000 parcels. About 26,000 of those are already eligible. About 15,000 are in PUDs where the rules of the PUD would dictate. And so changing the duplex rules shouldn't have an effect there. There's about 10,000 parcels that are below the minimum lot size, either because they were rezoned after they were platted or they were done using the cluster lot option. And so that leaves only about 8,000 parcels that would be might be affected by this change. And so that's, again, our estimate is about 10% of our parcels would be affected by this. So we're saying that both to say, like, there's an opportunity there for housing, there's an opportunity there for simplification, but it's a relatively small portion of kind of the overall stock of homes in the R districts. Okay, I'm gonna make a big shift here to talking about the alternative standards. Before I do that, any questions about R and RS?
Thank you. The question about R, so currently in the zoning code, R districts are allowed single and two family. So how would this be different?
So the two family is permitted with conditions.
Okay.
And so it's a lengthy section of the zoning code that lays out what those conditions are. And it's like if it was platted before a certain date in 1984, when they were kind of allowed everywhere. And then if they were subdivided, they were allowed to do 25% as duplex after that date. I think there's a few other conditions. It's actually a significant cost for codes because they have to research every parcel individually to find out if you can do a duplex. And so that's been something they've been interested in for a while. We think kind of this overall shift of doing all three of these together, that's kind of the question we're asking the public is, you know, we know some folks will be a little skeptical of this or a little skeptical of reducing the heights or vice versa. You know, just kind of putting these together feel like a reasonable balance.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just explain what is a half story? Like, how does that play out? And
Sure. So it's the core idea from a form perspective is that you've got a roof line, and the half story is the finished space under the roof line, like where the roof is coming in at a pitch.
Okay, so the walls don't go up; they're pit. Okay,
Right.
that makes sense.
Now there's kind of things that you put in to sort of specify exactly how that works in practice, but that's the basic.
But that's the idea. Okay, and then. Sorry, just one last quick question. The separate ownership for the dadus, are you thinking about, and I know that sounds like it's going to be a big a good discussion, but are you thinking about a separate ownership for actually the land, like the lot underneath the dadu, or the building itself would be in separate ownership, but the parcel would still be owned by?
I wouldn't say we've gotten that far.
Okay.
I mean, I think our expectation would be that it wouldn't. Subdivision of land is its own process, and I don't think we would look at changing those standards. And so, but given that we have a very active HPR, horizontal property regime regimen, that allows for independent ownership through a simplified condo system,
Okay.
I think that's more our expectation.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Two-story, and you reminded me when you mentioned that. Is a basement considered a story?
There's rules in the code for when a basement would be considered based on kind of how the grade lays and how much of it is exposed.
Okay, so that's been considered
Yep.
with this 2.5. Okay, thanks.
I would say that's part of what we want to keep our eye on as we're doing the rest of it, but so far we haven't talked about shifting that. Okay, so the next set of slides, and it gets a little wonky and a little in detail, but is sort of looking at the shift from what we call the conventional standards, which were adopted when the code was last comprehensively updated in the 1990s, to a set of alternative standards that were added, I think, in the mid-2000s. The conventional standards were very kind of suburban and auto-oriented. The alternative standards were sort of a shift become, one, correcting some of the issues with the conventional standards, but also getting them a little bit more walkable. And so things that both share, and so our goal in doing this is to create better and more predictable development patterns. A lot of the places where we have the conventional standards now are in use along our transit system, and especially along a lot of the higher capacity and frequent lines supported by Choose How You Move. And so we're thinking about kind of how do we start taking steps to getting the standards in place that support kind of the form, the walkability that you need to support transit service, as well as creating kind of more predictable development patterns, both for neighbors and for builders. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of like how that gets weird in a moment. The two sets of standards share things like lot area, building coverage, setbacks, and height. The alternative standards the alternative standards replace a height control plane with a build to and step back. I'll kind of talk through the details of that in a sec. Then the alternative standards also include things like floor to area ratio, requirements for the location and orientation of buildings, access, garages, that kind of thing. Most zoning districts that have both the conventional and the alternative standards, most properties are zoned with the conventional, about 16,000 acres. Only about 1,500 are zoned with the alternative districts, and that's across like each of the different zoning categories, except for mixed use, where there's a balance of both kinds. As part of this, we're also exploring tweaking the alternative standards themselves. One of the things that they have is a build-to line to sort of bring the building closer to the street rather than just saying no closer than this. And as part of that, they include a step back for upper floors. What we find is a lot of times that creates a form that's kind of more pushed back towards the neighborhood, but also a little bit tougher for builders to construct. So we see, I think there's a lot of cases at the BZA around that. And so we are considering removing the step back requirement to sort of bring it more fully up to the street. We're also looking at kind of requiring deeper build to outside of the UZO, again, recognizing that the alternative districts were kind of built a little bit more for urban areas and need to be tweaked to accommodate kind of suburban expectations. Thinking about requiring access from alleys when they're present, requiring minimum building depth for sort of active frontage, and then potentially thinking about height increases as part of that. Again, this is something we're trying to do kind of carefully and put it in context of what you can do under the base districts today. And so for that, I want to talk through what the conventional approach is to height. And so here it's the height control plane, where it sets a maximum height at the setback line, and then kind of a vertical increase for every foot you go past deeper than the setback. So this means in practice, many lots can go unexpectedly deep, especially very deep lots, or many lots can go unexpectedly high, especially very deep lots. And so to try to give you a sense of scale, this shows the number of properties that we have based on the parcel depth or the side measurement. And so there's a really big peak of properties around 162 feet deep. That's kind of a typical urban lot for Nashville. But you can see some of them go much, much deeper, 500 feet deep, 750 feet deep, that kind of thing. It's rare, but those conditions are out there. So the way the height control plane works is you've got a setback, that's the purple on the bottom, the front setback on the left, the rear setback on the right. You've got a height at setback in blue, and then the orange lines are sort of the height control planes. Typically what we see is 2 feet in height for each 1 foot in depth from the setback. And so measured from the front and rear, 50% creates the kind of the midpoint where the height is greatest. Now it's this triangular shape. So we wouldn't really see buildings right at that peak. You're kind of looking at how much floor plate you could fit in below that. And then there's lots of other constraints that come in. If there's an FAR limit, that would kind of keep the scale of the building down a little bit. And there's practical realities of construction types and kind of how big your floor plate can be and that kind of thing. But just to give a sense of scale, what I'm going to show through the next several slides is built around kind of that maximum height at midpoint, just so you have a sense of kind of how high that can get. The last thing I'll say is that this assumes a rectangular lot or a regular lot. Lots of our lots, especially in suburban areas, aren't like that, but that just sort of contributes to and adds to the complexity of understanding what can be built through the conventional standards. So this chart just takes that lot depth and converts it to a maximum height. And so whereas that peak of lot depth was about 160 feet, when you translate that over using the height control plane, you get to that max height is about 140 feet. Again, we don't expect buildings to actually get that high under this constraint, but it gives you a sense of how far it goes, how quickly. And so kind of a typical size urban lot, here are two examples. The one on the left is on Charlotte Avenue. It's 150 feet deep. It's 1/3 of an acre. It's coded in our GIS as regular, so you can see it's rectangular. And so the max height at the midpoint would be 130 feet. On the right is an example from Lebanon Pike, again, 140 feet deep, a third of an acre. It's not regular. You can see kind of the angles are a little wonky. And then you can imagine like kind of coming in from these different height control planes creates a very, makes it tough to sort of expect what are you able to do. So that's that kind of weird expectations or tough to figure out what's actually allowed here is part of what we're hoping to take a look at. So again, this is sort of the distribution of how many parcels by what the maximum height at that midpoint is. I'm now going to add what the height limit for CS alternative is in context of this. So it's 60 feet. So it's quite a bit more conservative than what is possible. Now again, that midpoint is not ever going to be achieved, but you've got quite a bit of height that you can get to short of that midpoint. So that's just to sort of highlight like how we're trying to get to like the weirdness of the current standard, the difficulty to implement, to something that is more predictable, brings the buildings closer to the street, away from the neighborhood, to kind of get a better urban form in support of the transit system and kind of overall livability. All right. Before I get to the new districts, the last thing I want to highlight is that we are working to calibrate an affordability bonus. This was enabled by the state a couple of years ago. I want to talk through some of the considerations that go into this. So one is that the state only gave us the authority to do it for rental housing. It's not an available tool for homeownership. Second is that it allows for a bonus on top of entitlements. So it's not something where we can apply an affordability requirement to someone's base entitlements, but we can say, if you go above this in some way, we can say that in exchange for that, we can put in an affordability requirement. That could be relaxing height for taller buildings. It could be relaxing a bulk standard for kind of added bulk, or it could just be a density bonus in terms of number of units within the existing bulk standards. And so that would take the form of some change in entitlements, like X change in entitlements, 2 stories or 0.4 FAR or something, for Y% of units at Z% of AMI. And so the calibration is figuring out what X and Y and Z are. And so that could be what standards are adjusted. It could be like making sure that we are kind of getting something that's worthwhile out of this bonus. So maximizing affordable unit production. So we don't want to set the exchange so high that nothing is produced. We don't want to set it so low that it feels like it's just a giveaway. We kind of want to find the right spot where we're getting something of value for the additional entitlements. Now, our expectation, and the economists are modeling this right now, but our expectation is the percentage of affordable units when the bonus is used is still likely to be pretty low. I mean, it's not something where you get an additional story and 50% of the units are going to be affordable. It may be 5%, it may be 10%. And figuring out kind of like a higher number of units versus a lower AMI, like that's part of the balance that we want to find as we calibrate. So the last section I want to talk through is 2 new residential districts. These are districts that we've talked about in the past as being a house scale district and a larger scale district. We've fleshed out what that looks like in practice. And then we've got examples of kind of the sections of the code and what that would look like. Again, the numbers aren't final, but I want to start, we're hoping to introduce people to them so that we get a sense of what this looks like, because it's, I think, a very interesting way to shape the form to get something that is, allows more units, but also kind of fits into neighborhood context a little bit better. So the 2 districts would be a residential neighborhood zone, which would be that house scale one. And this would be things like duplexes, plex houses, manor houses, house courts. And then a larger one called residential limited that would also include courtyard flats, multiplexes, and low-rise flats. And we've tried to, consciously mimic kind of the language that's in the code already, such as mixed-use neighborhood and mixed-use limited, to kind of suggest the scale and how people are used to thinking about those categories. So to implement this in the zoning code, there's kind of 3 sections that we would look to add. One would be a set of bulk standards that tie to the district. That's similar to the bulk standards for existing districts that we have. Then we would have uses, like what uses go with which districts. And then we would have form guidance for each of these different building types. So the district bulk standards, like I've been referring, this is an example, again, these numbers aren't final, but it's things like lot size, setback requirements, height requirements, that sort of thing. But the other thing I want to highlight is outlined in red. We've been referring to these as two different districts, but the consulting team is actually calibrating the standards for each district to suburban and urban contexts. So we're actually getting 4, we may actually get 5 districts out of these that are structured similarly, but are tailored a little bit better to whether you're in a suburban area, whether you're in an urban area, and whether you're in a more intense urban area. The next thing I want to show is the use table. So the blue uses and the blue columns are examples of our current residential uses and our current zoning districts. So you can see single family is permitted in RS, R and RM, two-family duplex, councilmember, to your question earlier, shows up as PC for permitted with conditions. The new districts are shown in green, but also that we would add these new uses for each one of these building types. And so the plex house or the manor house or the multiplex would show up. And then it would appear as permitted in conditions for each one of these. Now, every zoning district has a lot of different things that can go in, so R and RS as well include a lot of non-residential uses, things like daycares and schools, that kind of thing. We would look to pretty much mimic that and not make any changes in the current districts, but mimic that within the new districts. So here's an example of the first page. Here's an example of what what the first page of the conditions for one of the building types would look like. This is the plex house with a very famous plex house pictured to illustrate. A description of kind of what we're looking to achieve with this building type, and then some basic information, number of units per building, number of buildings per lot. This part is very straightforward. The next page, I think, is very interesting, and it gets to sort of, I think part of what we're getting with this consulting team is folks who have thought deeply, not just about, kind of these units in general, but what is it that makes it feel like it's part of a neighborhood. And so there's a few things that kind of took me a little bit of time to wrap my head around that I want to highlight. And so one is where they've kind of illustrated, labeled kind of a width and depth A and B. This is what they call the main body. And they've got a maximum width and a maximum depth for what can be built for that, as well as a maximum height. But then they've complemented that with a secondary wing. And that's got a smaller depth, a smaller width, and a smaller height. And the idea there is that that's just a very, very common form that you see in neighborhoods that have kind of been established, where they've kind of been added on a little bit over time. And so it kind of naturally creates a little bit more sensitivity to context. It mimics kind of the natural pattern of homes as they grow over time. They also have standards for, kind of common open space, kind of a minimum width, a minimum depth. This is really critical in some of the courtyard forms, the cottage court, the townhouse court, and the courtyard apartments, where you're really trying to build not just the homes, but that shared common open space. Our expectation is it's, as we've kind of been talking through with people, this is something that they're interested in. As we get the full set and kind of roll that out, our expectation is we're going to do a lot of kind of working with people to understand kind of all of the implications. We think this is really powerful. We think it's really useful, but it's also a very different way of regulating than what's in our base code today. So we're thinking through carefully kind of how to roll it out, how to do education for folks. Last, I just want to end, we're still anticipating in June having recommendations for the zoning code. And as part of that, we're thinking carefully about the phasing of those and kind of what the timing for that looks like. Thinking in terms of, changes that create opportunities but don't inherently change entitlements. The new districts are probably a little easier, whereas changes that affect current entitlements and expectations probably will need kind of a little bit longer time for the community to sort of think about and discuss. We're also thinking about the timing for the remainder of the work that we have for this project, which is the community engagement to develop a recommended rezoning plan for how to use the new districts to find opportunities to sort of get them tested out and built over the next couple of years. And then just to end, we've got a few more May workshops. We've got James Lawson High School in Bellevue next Friday, this room next Saturday for a morning session. We've added a virtual presentation June 2nd, and then we're working to schedule a second virtual presentation in Spanish, probably June 5th, but we're still waiting to nail that down. So as soon as we have that, we'll kind of do an email blast to let everybody know. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Well, are you going over the new potential zoning changes in the public meetings right now? Is that part of the presentation?
Yes, so it's kind of a board-oriented open house workshop. So there's not a presentation, but we have not quite this level of detail, but we kind of float all of these things during that meeting and spend a fair amount of time on the new districts in particular.
Okay. So thinking about Lisa's house as an example that would fit in the new district, obviously it's in a historic district of Edgefield, and, like how would that work? Like, I mean, if you wanted to create one of these new districts in an existing neighborhood, are we talking about having then to get the whole neighborhood kind of on board with doing a new district? Or I picture this for new development, fine. I'm struggling with like how you would make it work in existing neighborhoods.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the reasons we've thought about how to phase this to get the new districts adopted first, and so that we can sort of continue to test them out and show in practice, what it would look like on different sites. And then that helps to inform the engagement that we would do later in the year, where guided by Nashville Next, guided by the Growth and Preservation Concept Map, we're thinking about kind of within that 1/8 of a mile of our corridors, kind of where these would be appropriate. And so it's kind of what we can do to create that transition. What does that transition look like? What are the infrastructure constraints in a particular area? Where are the opportunities? Kind of what I've been telling people is we're going to be bound by that in sort of anything we roll out as a starting point. But as we hear from folks, hey, we've got concerns here, we've got concerns there, it's something we can bring in and sort of tailor to fit the area. But then also, if we hear from the community, hey, there's an opportunity just on the other side of the 1/8 of the mile, like as we discuss that and work that through, like we're not saying that's off the table. We can incorporate that in. It's that we're going to start with kind of the boundaries from Nashville Next.
Okay. And then one other question on the A districts, when you were talking about the fact that we would get rid of the step back, the step backs are only required with buildings over a certain height right now, right?
That's right.
So we basically are saying that those buildings would no longer have to have.
That's what we're taking a look at.
Because that can create a whole different set of issues. Like the step back gives you air. It's not, and it's visually appealing not to just have like a whole wall of high buildings. So like, I guess that's just one concern that I have is just,
So I think what we have found, and we are still looking at this, is that typically where the step back is for instance, I think MUL allows 3 stories and 45 feet at the build to line, and then you can step back 15 feet to go to 4 stories and 60 feet.
4 more stories or 4
No,
total?
I'm sorry, total of 4 stories
Okay.
and 60 feet. And what we have found is that it has actually created some odd forms where 15 feet of a step back, you're sort of just ending up with this weird wedding cake design that isn't providing for a lot of relief from the street, especially if you're a pedestrian sort of walking on the street. You're not going to perceive that 15-foot step back anyway, but it creates sort of an odd form where people have filled those in with like roof decks or whatever, but it's not achieving a super good urban design. And so that's why we wanted to look at it.
Okay.
And it may be that it's something, where we land is recommending eliminating it and continue discussion, or we say, well, we may recommend bringing up the height at which it starts.
Yeah.
So I think there's different ways to juggle that.
And I think I'm thinking about it more in the commercial the large scale stuff versus the smaller stuff. I can picture those houses you're describing.
Thank you. I have a follow-up to Commissioner Farr's first question about the new districts, just to make sure I'm clear. So you all, the planning staff will make recommendations on where we might implement these new districts based on where the areas are close to the corridor. There may be several parcels, for example, 1,000 parcels in that area that you're recommending go to these new districts. And that's what you'll be getting feedback from the residents in those areas about rezoning or adding these new districts to that zoning after your recommendations come out in June. Then you'll go back and talk
Later in the year.
Talk with the community about those recommended new zoning districts. I'm not sure how the process, I'm just thinking about when we expand the USD, for example, in the GSD district, where we go to the property assessor, get the number of parcels that we need, talk to those residents to make sure they try to get a consensus on agreeing to that new USD. So it'll be similar to that process. I guess the process after you've decided or after it's been decided, yes, we're going to rezone this area to this new district. Would the process to do that be similar, like expanding the USD?
I think it would be probably a little bit more similar to a community plan update. Okay. Where it's, I think what we would want to, we would want to make sure folks are aware of what's going on. I think we've mostly, part of it is a little bit of, it's something we're going to sort of figure out the process kind of when we get a little bit closer. But our expectation is we would have something that's a little bit more intense and focused on a specific geographic area, work through kind of in greater detail with that area, then develop kind of an overall recommendation, and then probably then vet again all of the areas together overall. And again, I think we're still trying to figure out the scale and the scope of all of that. What we want to try to assure folks of is it's not going to be something where we come out and just recommend sort of a blanket everywhere. We've got some boundaries we're working within. Once we've thought about those boundaries and done our assessment, there's engagement that's part of that. The exact sort of timing and look and feel and number of meetings, that's something that we've sort of done some initial thinking about, but it's real preliminary.
Well, your example about the community plan amendments, that's a good example. If the process is similar, then that gives me an idea of my head of how we would go about doing it. Thank you.
This sounds like an incredibly complex systems puzzle with many pieces, and I'm just wondering if one of those pieces is or could be consideration of the impacts on the tree canopy in that particular area, on green building design, on open space, whether incentivizing it or not losing it or creating it, or so if you could just talk to those points a little bit.
Yeah, I think some of that will be, figuring out once we get to that process, not just the engagement part, but sort of the analysis that gets us to the engagement. I think certainly we're mindful of the potential impact of zone changes on critical environmental features, floodplains, steep slopes, that kind of thing. I think tree canopy we can think about as well as think of how kind of these districts would connect to the tree standards that we have in the code. Green building is probably something that's outside of scope, but I think we can sort of review what opportunities we have for that.
Okay, great, thank you.
I have one more question. Can you go back to that slide which showed all of the uses that would go within that one? So we do still continue to have RSR, RM, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. But there's some overlap within that, right? Like the uses that are allowed within RS are going to be. Okay.
Yep.
I see. I just have to study this page for a minute.
Well, and again, it's preliminary. It's to help
Right.
y'all think about sort of the pieces that would implement the new districts. Our thinking is kind of once, as we get a little further along and we have kind of a more complete set of things, figuring out kind of opportunities for the commissioners to review that, as well as the public to review it in detail before we bring something that's kind of ready for adoption.
And a good way to, a good way to sort of frame how we're thinking about it is if you look at the chart of the current districts, they build on each other. So RS for residential uses, now it does allow other uses, other non-residential uses, but for RS for residential uses, it's single family. And then R, you pick up dados and two family, and then RM, you pick up multifamily. And so you're sort of, they all add on to the next. And so it would be the same with the new RN and RL that we're studying. RN being neighborhood, you pick up a few. RL being limited, you pick up a few more.
Okay.
So the optionality becomes greater with, as you move up in the districts.
Okay. Okay, so single-family attached housing,
Townhomes.
townhouse, where does that fit today? That would fit under R, right?
RM.
RM.
And
With some limited instances in R where you can have 0 lot line.
Okay.
Yeah,
it's a weird category right now in
It
our
is.
code.
But some of these uses that are in green today fit under those three.
a lot of them fit under RM, and a lot of, I think one of the reasons that we have probably seen so many SPs come through is because SPs allow for sort of flexibility in the type of units and the combination of the type of units that maybe some of our base districts don't allow now.
No, that makes sense.
So we've seen, you have seen all of these different forms and types in various plans throughout the years. This is just giving a more streamlined approach and process to allowing them.
I think the other way to think about it that gets to sort of our overall diagnosis of the code and kind of some of its challenges is basically like all of these types are allowed within RM if you've got a lot size big enough, if you've got the density big enough to allow them. But if you've got that zoning and you've got that density and you've got that lot size, you have no idea if any of these would be built or something else completely differently. So that's kind of the trade-off that we're trying to make is we're being a little bit more prescriptive on the form, but trying to say, well, let's have a little bit more area that's RN, where you don't know which form it's going to be, but it's going to be one of these forms. You're going to have more confidence that the scale is appropriate. Whereas like if you've got an RM district and on a large enough lot, it could be really, really entirely out of scale and character in a way that makes people distrust having that zoning designation.
There's gonna be a lot of education on those two.
I mean, it's been, I mean, like, so I'm a data guy. I'm not a design guy. And I think it's been useful, like me in this role, to see like, well, it took me a while to like think through, well, what does it mean to have a maximum building like width and a maximum building depth? And like thinking through like, how does that function? And why do you have a secondary wing? I mean, I think it is, you're right. I think it's a lot of education. But I do think like it's all sort of getting to this point of something that looks and feels in keeping and is kind of builds and supports a neighborhood rather than something that's threatening. I mean, like, last night I had a conversation with a couple of folks who came in and were very concerned about, kind of their neighborhood being torn down and destroyed. And I kind of walked them over to one of our posters. It's like, here's examples where we've gotten really out of character buildings, like a modest size single family house with like the pitched roof and a little porch entryway, and then a really tall, like very flat face thing on the front of it. And so just talking them through, like, what is it that makes the one on the left feel in scale and the one on the right feel out of scale? And so the team that we've brought in, they have thought for years about what it is that makes that, what it is about the frontage, what it is about sort of the natural step back of the main body and the wing. And so like there's a lot to unpack there. But I do think it's got pieces that are like get to what it is that people respond to in existing neighborhoods that a lot of times we're missing in the newer construction. Thank you all so much.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.